Good morning, everyone. So my intention today is to disrupt you. I want to change, and hopefully I'm going to infuse the way you're going to look at the future, the way you're going to have your debates in the next day or two, and how you're going to practice that in the business. That's all I need to do. Let me start by saying a couple of things, and I just want to infuse your thinking and just share the experiences I've had, and I think I can say in over 29 African countries and perhaps 5 European countries, of making serious mistakes so that you may not make the same mistakes I have made. That's all I can do, and I think that's the intention. And I'm going to make some statements. Walt Disney said that you can dream to create the most beautiful place in the world, but it takes people to make that a reality. And in all the transformation journeys I've been to or been through, people is what stops the job, is what makes it happen. I'll also say something else. Change cannot be managed. If you're thinking you're going to manage change, you've lost the plot. You can only prepare yourself, and then it must happen. So our job as transitioners or transformer people or hoping to transform organizations is to prepare ourselves. Then change will happen. I also say a couple of things. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. It doesn't matter how good a strategy you have. If your culture is not right, you lost the plot. And people ask, what is culture? Culture is the behavior of leaders. It's not about the values we put on the wall. It's not about all nice cliches we put up on the wall. It's how do I behave? When you think about executives around the table, if we do not say good morning, we do not look at each other in the eye and trust, that is culture. So I want you to think about that. So mine is to disrupt you, but I would like to call it constructive disruption. I'm going to say things. All I'm doing is sharing practice. Now, one of the thoughts, one of the experiences I like to share, I like to start with an anecdote of saying, in the Western world, when we got to study, we're trained about project management. When we execute in business, we have projects that start at a particular time and they end at a particular time. And we create milestones. We drive people to deliver specific milestones. That's how we work. We insist on Monday, I want this done. That I always say that's probably a projectized approach to looking at things. But it doesn't always happen like that. And we also have to remember we're in Africa and our cultures are different. So I put it to you, there's an alternative. You see, in Africa, life is a circle. And I don't know whether you've watched the movie Lion King, where they talk about the circle of life. Things don't start at a particular point. There's no straight line in terms of how you projectize execution. I like to suggest to you that it's a circle. And a circle you can start anywhere. Okay, so when you come into a meeting, you have to know where you are at in that circle. And why do I say that? Because if you go back to our forefathers and traditionalists, we went out to graze, we planted the crops, the rains came, things happened, people got married, they had children, people were buried. It's a circle of life. And there's a clear distinction between that and what happens in the Western world in terms of perception. So when you're managing a project and people in Africa, you have to understand that culture of circle of life. Now the distinction is in the circle of life, the motivation, the ignition to do something starts from without, not from within. So if you're managing people in Africa, you have to say, what are my touch points? A lot more than the project. So what I'm basically saying, not everything in the Western world works for Africa. So you have to see how do you calibrate that. On my logo up there, I hope you see fingerprints. Mine is to call upon you to leave fingerprints in everything you do. What's your mark? What's your legacy? So let's start our journey of thinking through this. I like to put it to you that if you want a new formula, you do not try and change anything. You cannot change anything by using the status quo. You have to substantially change the game. And hopefully I'm going to infuse in you some thoughts about the game. Number one, and I'm going to suggest to you, I hear a lot of conversations around Gen Z. I spend a lot of time doing consumer research and working in companies. One of the things that is very clear is actually Gen Z is not the most shocking trend. The fundamental change, the most customer, the most consumer, the customer or consumer that has changed significantly is the 60-year-old plus. I don't know whether you know that. The 60-year-old plus customer or consumer is the one that has changed mostly. So you're thinking Gen Z, just hold your horses. Okay, they've changed their lifestyles. So you need to think about that, and that research has just been released about a week ago. But it's thinking about that. So we need to change how we operate. You also have to do two things simultaneously. You've got to create the future, but you also have to sustain today. So the question I'm going to ask you is, in your own organizations, as you think about transformation, who is creating the future and who's focused on servicing today's business? Because you cannot have the same teams. There are different competencies. So how do you structure your organization? That's the first question I put to you. You have to have people focused on the future. At executive level, we used to have a timesheet when I worked at Tiger Brands. And at executive level, you want the executives focused on 80% creating the future. How do you do that in your performance management? Mine is to raise questions. Yours is to go and debate the answers to those questions. Mine is to share my experiences and challenge the status quo. I also position to you another thought. When you're executing strategy, there are two things you have to do. You've got to run today's business, which is your ops, but you also have to have change, the tactics of how you transition to tomorrow. I'm posting there so that you think about it carefully. So in the organization, who is running operations? What teams are focused on running operations? What teams are focused on the future? Because those require different competencies. And it cannot be the same individual. So one of the lessons I've learned is when you structure the organization, you need to split that. Ops versus change. And change is not for HR. I'm not talking about HR. Change is the job of the CEO. It's the job of the executive. That's what they should do every day. So it's the tactics of how we transition from where we are today to tomorrow. I also put it to you that sometimes when we look from a HR point of view, we look at people from a competence, position competence. I'm a good accountant. I'm a good marketeer. That's position competence. But what we do not infuse in them is what I call transition competence. How do they get to the next generation? How do they move from playing the Premier League to playing the Champions League? That's what's going to be the differentiator for the future. I underline transition competence is what you require. And half the time, you don't see that in the programs that are around. So change management is about equipping people for transition. Just a thought for you. If you're going to forget everything else I'm going to say today, do not forget this one. It's the way you need to think about your business. And I think I heard someone talk about top-down. This is the real top-down. You have to get strategy right. The strategy has to be very, very clear. Once you have set a strategy for the business, then that drives structure. And I'll explain to you how structure looks like in a little while. Once you're clear with structure, then that drives the people you need to fit in that. I always say that drives the jockeys you need to ride the horses. Once you're clear with people, then you implement processes, you define those processes. Those processes then define systems. Very often in organizations, when we're thinking about transition and transformation, we want to buy the next sexy system, the next process. We want to do process reengineering, but half the time we have not architected strategy and the structure of the future. So it's always top-down, never bottom-up. I say that with absolute clarity. You got to get it. Everything works. So if you change structure, everything else changes. If you change people, processes and systems must change. But it's not the other. You cannot have a system and drive it up into strategy. So you can see also that people is at the center of that matrix. It's a glue that ties the strategy and structure to processes and systems. So if you don't get that right, we're going to lose the plot. The unexplicit matters most. And this is an experience I want to share. And the reason is blood, because I'm going to read it to you and because it's hot. I did some work at Nordstrom in the US, which is one of the top tier supermarkets. This is their HR manual. I'm going to read it to you. It's one page. This is a photocopy. It says, "We are glad to have you with our company." Notice the language, with our company, not in our company. Do you see the key distinction? You're assimilating somebody. This is a partnership. Our number one goal is to provide outstanding customer service. They don't have 15 goals. They're not talking about value statements. They are very clear in articulating what they want. Set both your personal goals and professional goals high, so they accept the concept that individuals who work in organizations must also have personal goals that may be outside the organization. We have great confidence in your ability to achieve them. So they are not testing your competence. You've been hired. It's not about the CV now. And then they say, Nordstrom rules. Rule number 1, use your good judgment in all situations. There will be no additional rules. So there are not 35 pages of HR manual to sign, IT disclosure manual to sign. It's one page. And it's not signed. Then it says, there will be no additional rules. Please feel free to ask your departmental manager, store manager, or divisional manager anything at any time. Open door policy. That's the only manual you receive when you walk to Nordstrom. Now, I'm not saying go and do that tomorrow. There has to be a transition. But let me show you how it works. So, someone walks into Nordstrom, and this is a real-life story. A gentleman from Africa. He wants to change some trousers that he bought there some time ago, or that were bought, or he had. So he walks in, says, "Could you change my pants for me?" And the lady who's attending says, "Sure." They change, they give him another size. They did not ask him for the receipt. They did not ask him for your mother's address or your postal address. You know the things you asked, and we're going to send it to your credit card. And when she was asked, "Why did you do that?" she says, "Rule number 1, use your good judgment in all situations." And her view was, even if it was not bought here, it's good marketing. He's going to tell the story. Okay, so that's the idea. Then there was another gentleman who wanted to buy some dress for his wife in Africa. So he walks in there. He could not remember the size, which is not unusual. So the attendant goes in and looks for all the other attendants, lines them up and says, "Which one is likely to be the size of your wife?" Asked, "Why did she do that?" Rule number 1. So do you see how structure drives behavior? So the point I'm making is, do not focus on behaviors. Focus on structure, but to get structure right, focus on strategy. And structure is not the organogram. I want to suggest to you there are 2 ways of looking at leadership. Leaders as psychologists, and then I'll come to the next one, where you start by thinking that the values are going to drive expectations. The expectations would drive consistent behavior. So in transformation, we tend to focus quite a bit on values. I suggest to you This is intuitive, but it doesn't always work. We do a lot of psychometric tests to check that the personality is right. Therefore, if we have people of a particular score on the psychometric test, they're likely to churn out consistent behaviors. My friends, you're wrong. I suggest there's another way of looking at it. Focus on the strategies. Focus on the structure. That will drive the tasks. That will drive the expectations. So you focus on architecting structure. So what I'm suggesting to you is that the way to tackle transformation and change is structure, strategy. I'm assuming strategy is not too complicated, I would hope. But the one that is underrated is focusing on structure. How do we organize? And structure includes even how the coffee shop is, how the office is. I was working in a Canadian mining company in South Africa. We were mining gold. There's only one thing I didn't like was going underground. It took about 35 minutes to go 1 kilometer below sea level, just to give you. But one of the things we understood, and which is quite important when you think about it, is if you want to drive safety as something that's important, then you focus on the structure. You focus on how you organize things. But one of the key things we did as a CEO, most people used to say, we don't know what the CEO does. So I suggested to the CEO, why don't you move your office to the reception? Okay? And we created a glass office. It was still soundproof. But when you came to the environment, you did not see the telephone operator or the receptionist. You saw the CEO working. And people now began to believe he actually does some work. Okay? That now influenced how people are behaving in the organization. Can you see how structure changes things? So again, I said to you, focus on structure. And I'm going to talk about the work that I'm doing, but I wanted to get some of these concepts out of the way in the meantime. Now I want to talk about the future and the future of digitization and my experiences. I want, as a show of hands, how many of you know an app called Shein? S-H-E-I-N. Let me see in this. I'm likely to get more ladies. Shein is S-H-E-I-N, right? If you have a teenage daughter or a generation alpha in your house, you're likely to know about it. Okay? If you don't know about it, you're not digitized. You need to experience it. Okay? Shein sells everything, especially to young people. Okay? You can get. It's on a platform. How many of you know Temu? You see? A few people. Temu has more downloads than Amazon in the last 1 year. So if you're still thinking of buying things in Amazon, the ground has shifted. The tectonic plate has moved. So if you're going to be HR practitioners, you need to be in the know. Because this is what people in the organization are doing. These are platforms that are digitized platforms. So it's important to remember that. So I want to talk about some key thoughts. One is just to think about, and I'm sharing some elements about digitization. There are 6 basic trends. And I'm going to tackle them in no particular order. Mine is just to share a story. On the right-hand side, you're going to see cult. I want to talk about cults. We're seeing what we call the cult age. Now, I know you might not follow Taylor Swift, or you may. But Super Bowl, when Super Bowl was on, if you follow that in the US, they discovered that 90% of the people who are watching Super Bowl were Taylor Swift followers. Now, you think that Super Bowl is very mature, and therefore Taylor Swift has got lower or younger people. But the point is the association of brands. There's a cult around Taylor Swift. So when she goes to a Super Bowl event, everyone else goes there. That's the new age. Now, there's also a drink that is called Prime that was selling in the UK for about 6,000 shillings, a little juice which is sugar and nothing more than that. All the young people were paying that to get that drink. It's just a mixture of sugar. The point I'm making, they were doing that because it's a cult. It was looking cool. So the point I'm introducing to you is think about cults in your organizations. Think about cults in society. What are they doing and how are they influencing behavior? Innovation is a new driver. How's the organization featured for innovation? Mobile. We all have mobile phones. It's creating the demand. How are you using it in our business? Brand equity becomes the new thing. What is it? How is my brand associated to something? People will not buy. Gen Zs might move away from a brand because it's not fulfilling a particular purpose. And then there's a whole sense around legacy and disruptors. And there's a high propensity for people to switch. People are no longer loyal necessarily to a brand if it does not deliver to them what they aspire for. So thinking about digital entities are raising the bar. And I'm setting these for you as you think about the future. So what are the determinants of success in a kind of a digitized environment? On the left-hand side, strategically, it's about delivering customer value. Seamless customer journeys. When a customer comes in your association, in your company, in your business, how do they get value? How do they walk the journey? Are the people, how is HR, how are the people working with that consumer? So customer journeys is absolutely critical in transformation because that's where you hire people to work with a customer to deliver value. So if you do not understand the customer journey, then it's just by default. And you have to create differentiated propositions. Okay. You also have to reduce reliance on tech. I always say reduce tech debt. We invest a lot in technology. It costs money. You have to reduce, make it optimum. You might be spending a lot of money on tech, but is it actually adding value to the customer? Improving agility. We talked about agility. Lower the cost and income ratio. So there's a whole bouquet of things around how transformation is happening in business. But the key message I want you to take home is customer journeys. Understanding customer journeys. If you do not understand that in HR, then you're hiring people to do a job for which there's no correlation between their performance and what the kind of impacts on that customer journey. Think about a customer journey as when you walk to a supermarket. You walk through the door, you want to buy a loaf of bread, you walk to where the bread is, you pick it up, put it in the trolley, go to the counter, pay, exit, go to your car, or go to the border, and you go home. That's your customer journey. So how does it interact with the people in that environment? Then also think about some digital kind of transformation things that impact on people. Obviously, process automation impacts on people, the technology itself, understanding data. So when you're hiring people, you need to understand data. You need to understand how, and the whole thing around data science is absolutely critical. So people need to have an aptitude for data now, not just financial acumen, but the use of data. And it's not about just analyzing it, it's saying, so what? So creating an organization that is agile around some of those elements. But again, notice customer journeys. There are a lot of technology trends that are happening, social media, that's impacting, internet, cloud, mobility, big data. We've talked about this in different ways. The question I'm putting to you is what does this mean to human capital? How are people equipped to work with social media? It's not just about posting, it's about what you're posting, it's about the essence of it. And I'm just giving you a flavor so that we can now talk about a specific experience. Then I call this non-stop customer experience. Before, we thought customers went to sleep at midnight or maybe at 6 p.m. Nowadays, there's non-stop customer service. But your organization is asleep. Your people are at home. What's happening to the customer at that point? How do you deal with that non-stop? Because if you ask people to work late or to work long, I used to be in Uganda Telecom, and we used to run a 24-hour call center. And we knew that the worst time was between 1 in the morning and 5 in the morning. Because people are tired, they're sleepy, and customers are pretty annoyed at that point. How do you deal with non-stop customer service? Because that's what customers are looking for. If I have a bank account, my bank account is alive at 1 a.m. Even if M-Pesa is shut on that time, my bank account is alive. What's my experience? And how do I deal with it? So I'm just putting this to you. And then when you think about operation improvement, a lot about process and efficiency, how equipped are your customers, or rather your employees, for process automation, agility, and new business models, thinking outside the box. This one I want to slow down a little bit. This is one of what I call architecting the future. If you think of the top side, youth, SME, consider those as segments of the market, right? So how do you structure your organization to serve those segments? In other words, what I'm suggesting to you, when you now put up your organogram, when you now put up your teams, the first thing you should understand is what are the customer segments that I'm going to serve. If those segments is, for example, Gen Z, instead of where I have youth, then you have to ask yourself, which team should I constitute that serves best that Gen Z segment? So you're designing your organization outside in, starting with the outside, looking at the segments that are at play, therefore strategic segmentation, strategy first, and then asking the question, how best can I serve those segments? And remember, the way you serve those segments is through customer journeys. So how do I organize? Is it teams around segments? So that's what I call segment business teams. But to access those segments, you might use the internet, you might use mobile, you might use different channels. So who are your channel teams? Because your channel teams are distinct from the segment business development teams. And then you have to develop a product for a segment. What are the product teams that develop a product for the segment that is then sold through a channel? I hope you see my thinking here. It's really saying that one fundamental point I want you to take home with you is, how do you re-architect your organization around segments? And how do you organize the teams? In short, this is not for the executive team to do only. This is strategic HR. This is architecting the future. And then behind that, you'd have operation teams that are in the back office, keeping the mill running, keeping the lights on. How are those teams organized? So always think segment, channel, product. Now this is a fundamental shift, but this is what transformation means. So you have to think about the organization moving from the structures you have today, transitioning to this kind of architecture for the future. Then also, there was the old way of doing business yesterday. You had a front office, you had mid office, and you have big back offices, legacy, big accounting offices. I think what's changed now is you have more people in the customer journey on the right, the business of tomorrow. So you architect more around journey orchestration, data and lean the core. The core is very lean. So your back office should be very lean. So one of the transformation projects I'm doing in Zim for 2 banks and 1 insurance company, this is exactly what we're trying to do, re-architecting around journey orchestration. So basically, it's you understanding what's the customer journey and architecting your business around that. On the right hand, you'll also see the differentiation in return. In yesterday, you had what I used to call 3x return. If you organize around journeys, you have 20x return. The return on investment is much higher, and this is from facts and research. So bear that in mind as well, how you organize yourself. So there's a business case. This is just to articulate, and I think we had the point about agility. So the old organogram, where you had a hierarchy top down on one side, but moving towards teams, cells. Someone used to call them Al-Qaeda cells, but I'll not use that word. Okay? But you have teams organized around segments, teams organized around channels, teams organized around products, teams organized around projects. That's the Agile methodology. But you can see the executive leadership is at the center. It's just really the conductor to the orchestra. But you move from organizing it on the left to how transitioning it to the right. Just a way of thinking about agility. And how are those teams constituted? Those teams must have at least 3 ingredients: customer experience people, business process people, and technology. You don't have IT or technology sitting in town on some kind of a hierarchy in a different place. You immerse them. You blend the team into one unit. That's here the transformation. So think about teams that are executing. That team should be self-sufficient with everyone on it. Just a way of thinking about those teams. And then you need to think about execution. You need to allow that these teams will not release something that's perfect on day one. So you have to allow them to make mistakes, to iterate the product over and over again. So the old way of performance management, where you needed to deliver something in this quarter without making a mistake, that's out of the window. You have now to look at how do you allow teams to make mistakes and still grow. And then, of course, within that system, and I'm just talking about the releases of product, the releases of execution will have release 1, release 1.5. How do you allow teams to have what I can call quick incremental gains rather than waiting for the Big Bang Theory at the end of the month or at the end of the year? This is just to give you an idea of a customer journey. You need to architect that. Then you need to say, how do I structure my organization? Who's going to be creating awareness? Is it marketing? How do we encourage the customer to buy it in consideration? When the customer is purchasing, who are they interacting with? When we're providing a service to a customer, who is doing that? How do we get them back in terms of loyalty? So organizing your organization around these elements. And this is just to kind of give you an idea. This is another way of now saying, if I know the customer journey, what are the touch points by department? So I hope I'm kind of disrupting your thinking about how you thought about structures and HR. It's a question of saying, you start with understanding your customer, which is strategy. In other words, HR rises much, much higher than where it's been before. Very often in businesses, we relegate HR to do admin. That can be done by AI. But the human part of structuring these, the differentiator of the future is going to be the humanity. Even with AI, how do you interact with that? When you infuse that humanity, that's why your brand equity is. So when you're thinking about transformation, think about infusing humanity in a digitized environment. Some other quick thoughts. When you're running the business, you have 3 things you have to do. You have to fix certain things, you have to optimize others, and you have to grow the business. So the question I ask you is, who is fixing? Who's optimizing? Who's growing? Because those are separate teams in the transformation. So when you engage with the executives, you've got to understand, because the competence for fixing is not the same as the competence for growth. When I worked in GlaxoSmithKline, we had a rule. If we were sending an executive to Africa to a market, we used to ask ourselves, what's the nature of that business? Does it need fixing? Is it optimizing or grow? And we decided who the CEO would be based on their competencies to perform that specific. If it was fixing, we used to give them 24 months. And then after 24 months, we'll remove them and put somebody who will grow the business. So it's accepting that you cannot have all the competencies in one human being. Then you also have to think about innovation, because we talked about innovation. There are three elements, three horizons of innovation. Defending your core business, growing your business into adjacencies, and transformation. So in your organization, you need to be able to architect and say which teams are in Horizon 1, which teams are in Horizon 2, which teams are in Horizon 3, because it cannot be done by the same animal. So if you don't have this in your structure, you're going to fail. Okay, let me put it more diplomatically. You will not transition to the new future. Then you also have to be very clear. How are you going to compete? And there are basically three things you can do. Either you're going to be very good in a product, very good in operation excellence, or very good in customer connectedness. That then drives the competencies you need in the organization. You cannot be everywhere. You have to be at least reasonable in everything. But if it's about product, then innovation comes in. R&D comes in. So thinking about how you're going to compete as well. I want to talk about growth. There are basically 4 levels of growth: diversification, product development, market growth, and market penetration. But I suggest to you, that's what we've had when you listen to business plans. There's a 4th and perhaps 5th. I call it convergence. I want you to think about Safaricom. Safaricom started as a as a mobile company, but now they're into financial services. Those things are coming together to create growth. That's what I call convergence. Strathmore can be doing what they're doing today, but tomorrow they could be doing something else that converges with education. So growth is going to be in convergence zones. Therefore, you need to be thinking about that in terms of how you structure your organization. How do you allow that agility? And then, in a digital environment, there are basically 4 things you're driving. You're delighting customers, you're empowering employees, you're digitizing operations, and you're accelerating development. So beginning to think around, how do I empower employees? Can you see how that's in the center? So when you digitize, it's not about an app. It's about changing the culture. It's about a way of life, of doing things. And inherently, and perhaps more substantively, it affects the employees. And that is why change management transition is very good, or very important. Now, in the positioning of ourselves in the digital era, we have to be very clear about a couple of things. We're creating access, we're engaging with customers, we're customizing what we offer them, we're connecting with them, we're having a conversation, whether it's on Twitter, whether it's on Facebook, it's a live conversation, and you're collaborating. So how are we equipped? How are we structured? Who connects to the customer? Who customizes requirements? How do we engage with them? How do we have access? Because employees will have the same benefits. In other words, your employees will behave exactly the same as your customer. As I come to close, some thoughts, and then I'll summarize for you. You need to ask yourself a couple of questions when you think about Africa. What are the market segments I'm going to serve? Remember, we talked about structuring around the segments. And therefore, how am I going to structure? What are my constraints? And how do I deal with them? What are the risks? And most of the risks will be around people. What projects do I need to execute? What partnerships do I need? What investments? Once you've done that, then you can now decide and say, what structures do I need? What people do I need? Again, what I'm saying is HR is actually the driver to strategy, as opposed to waiting for strategy to be compiled and brought to HR to execute. I always say the key thing, the main thing is to keep the main thing, but you need to know what's the main thing. And for me, the main thing that I want you to take home with you is structuring around customer segments. Having the competencies to serve that, and also defining what are the transition competencies required. So as you go to have some discussions, and I'm going to pause in a minute, think about how you're going to create disruption. And I can only share one last story in the business that I'm doing out in Zimbabwe and a few other markets. Digitization is your biggest enemy and it's your biggest asset. HR practitioners have to understand how it affects the life cycle of the employee. So when an employee wakes up, now think about it, an employee is probably going to be on TikTok at 1 a.m. in the morning. Okay, their own personal TikTok. They're reporting to the office at 7 or 8 in the morning. They get on WhatsApp. You need to understand the whole cycle of how they're interacting. It also creates additional stress. So you need to map around the behaviors that are necessary to execute in a digital era. But you need to understand that digital zone as well. So I think my lesson is always structure, thinking about the customer, but thinking about how that employee is going to interact with the customer. That should be your denominator. That should be a determinant. That should be a differentiator. But do not forget to infuse humanity. I'm assuming we'll have some thoughts around that. So that's what I wanted to share with you in a couple of thoughts. Also remember 3 other things. Town halls don't work. The business of talking down to people and telling them something used to work before. I think Gen Z is a testament. So you have to have a way of engaging differently. Secondly, they have to see the culture in you. Culture is your behavior, and the behavior of leaders is what's going to determine everything. Think about mobility and interoperability. The idea that an employee can be doing something in Nairobi today, but they can transition to another department almost instantaneously. That you need to create a whole brand image around that. That's the basis of it. That's exactly what happens in digitization. So I hope I've given you some thoughts to disrupt yourself. Happy to take any questions if that's allowed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is James Muhia from Safaricom. Boniface, I want to appreciate the nuggets of wisdom that you've shared from diverse experiences. I particularly love the element around a frictionless customer journey, and it's imperative for us as HR practitioners to reflect about a seamless, frictionless employee journey and how those two are augmented. The question that I do have is, from your experience, or is there a metric as to how you balance out? You did speak about spending time in strategy, structure, which is quite core, and I love the whole segment-led element of it. But is there a metric in terms of the amount of time input where one needs to focus on disruptive versus maintaining the core? Thank you.
I'll just share my experience. Maintaining the core 20%, disrupting 80%. If your executives are not doing that, they're not going to create the future. I always say you can win the rat race, but you're still a rat. So you have to be able to play a different game. I mean, if you want to win the Champions League, then you have to spend your time building that team. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Boniface, for what you have shared with us and the challenging thoughts. Mine is in an intersection, so there are 2 lines that are ringing on my head. The first one was digital first brands, raise the bar, and then in between, you mentioned that the differentiator of the future will be humanity. And this brings an essence to me that, yes, there'll be AI and we need to drive digitalization. Then the question I'm asking is, where or what are your thoughts on digital wellness or well-being in this transformation? Thank you.
So let me deal with the last bit about digital wellness. The challenge we have in businesses and in the way we live is we are still living the old and expecting somebody to transform in the new. So we're creating stress. So you have an employee who still has to have a manual system, a spreadsheet, a ledger. But then you also want them to take that and enter it into a data system. Do you get the point? So you now created stress. You have not given them the ability to say, we're going to move to this new future. You want them to do both, and something's going to crack. So in my experience, a lot of the projects we do with teams, what we do is we create separate teams. One team creates the future, one team maintains the old. And then in time, once the future system is in place or the elements in place, then you then move one team to the other. You have to allow people space. The second thing as well is in a digital environment, you have to allow people time off. Time off does not mean that they're sitting doing nothing. So if they're doing a 6-hour job, that's a 6-hour intense job. So you have to allow breaks in between. Like they do with the airline pilots, that's what you have to think in the digital era. You have to allow people, I have a stretch of 2 hours, but after 2 hours, I have a break, just the way they do. In the modern cars now, some of them, they switch off. They require you to stop driving after 2 hours. So it's thinking about that wellness and create. Don't deal with the mental health after the event. It's too late. Build it into structure. And the first point, I think I lost it. Oh, sorry, digital brands. So digital brands, so I don't know what you have on your table, but if I now sit here, a lot of what's happening at Strathmore is online. That's a digital brand. Some activities already happening online. So it's really being aware that the problem with online is that you're always on. There's no switch off. Remember, non-stop customer service. So you need to be able to have separate teams interacting with faces of that online availability continuously. And that goes back to structure. I don't think I can emphasize enough structure. If you forget everything else, wake up at night and remember structure. Thank you.
Okay, a question here. Thank you very much, Boniface, for that thought-provoking session. There are many things to think about, but something struck me about creating a culture where people are allowed to fail. I think maybe the Gen Zs are different, but for the Gen X and the Gen Y, this was not allowed right from home. And we carry these behaviors to the workplace. So how can we disrupt ourselves to allow organizational cultures that are safe enough, that allow people to fail, because that brings about experimentation and innovation and people speaking up, to give ideas. Thank you.
I think I can probably just share an anecdote. So I was hiring a general manager for a business in Cameroon when I was working Tigers, an FMCG business. And we were struggling to find the right competence, the right profile, because Cameroon, it's a bit more difficult. You want someone who speaks French and who's going to move into the country. And there were very young people in the plant. So what I thought about, and this did not happen by design, happened by default, and I'll come to that as well, is then we realized the traditional structure was to hire somebody to go there permanently. The challenge with that is it restricted your profile. So we then said, why don't we look for a wise old man who has the experience? He can go there once a week. And once he's there, we then have a team of younger people who learn from him. Now, what did that do? The older person did not have an issue of passing on knowledge because he didn't have to prove anything to himself. The younger people also respected his experience. So I think the way that I'm beginning to see the world is to say, you need to have what I can call teams that are constituted between different demographics, different competencies working together. Now, the team that has made most failures from research are the 60-year-olds and plus. because they've lived longer naturally. The younger Generation Z have not made mistakes that are serious yet. So you have to think about that as well. So how do you allow them to experiment? They need the comfort of a wiser person. In other words, there's no such thing as old anymore in the organization. It's a question, how do you tap in? And we have found that experiment worked very well for us in Tiger, infusing the old with the new and letting them work together. But that also requires something else. It requires HR to act as a facilitator in meetings. So HR becomes a facilitator. You stand in meetings, you ask the question. You're not sitting in there waiting to fill in the leave form. Hope that gives you a thought around that.
All right, I think we can take 2 more questions.
Good morning, and thank you for that provoking conversation. I'm very curious to know about what the 60-year-olds, you said something and you didn't quite.
Sorry, say that again.
I'm very curious to know about the 60-year-old.
The 60-year-old?
Yes.
Okay. So we started off this research because one of the things I do for consumer companies is research. And we started with a hypothesis like you do in business school when you're writing your thesis. You start with the hypothesis of saying, where is the future of the customer? And our hypothesis was to say generally Gen Z and millennials are the new customers. So we're trying to test that hypothesis. But what we discovered is that when people have money, you have a large group of middle class, or people who've left formal work, or people who don't need to work, but they have the money to spend. And what you find is above 60, they engage in a lot of other activities. They're in a golf club. They're doing something at the church. They're promoting a new product. They're entrepreneurs. They go on holiday. They go on camping as boys. You get the point? I mean, I can give an example, and probably it's not a good example, but I'll say it. I mean, I have a friend who has 6 bikes in South Africa, 6 high-powered motorbikes. But that's his hobby. So they engage in different things, and they like to go to the supermarket. They want to go out there and have coffee. So you have a different level. So you can assume everything's going to be bought online, but you've forgotten this customer. And remember, that 60 group is going to grow. So those are some of the anecdotes. They also want to go back to school. They want to lecture. They want to spend time with their grandchildren. So they have a different ecosystem, but they are the key influencers. And the Gen Zs will begin to look up to them. So it's just actually thinking about that. So how you used to segment. So Gen Z are probably more homogeneous, but there are other sectors coming in. Alpha generation is also an interesting one. So that's probably what I have discovered. So it's growing. They have a lot of money to spend, a lot of money, and therefore you can work with them. Any other question?
One at the back.
Okay, I have a question. Your earlier statement around change management, you mentioned that change cannot be managed. What are your thoughts around leading change, or, as leaders or HR leaders who are actually driving transformational change in the organization? What are your thoughts around that? Is it calculative or disruptive?
So let me just kind of put a caveat and qualify. When I say change cannot be managed, it's because it's like the wind. It's like the weather. It just happens. Now, what you can do is understand what is happening in your environment and react to that in terms of a service or product or business ecosystem you want to build. So the understanding of what's happening in the environment is strategic and absolutely critical. That's why I talked about segments. That's talked about understanding the behavior of your consumer. That's a question of understanding where the trends are. Once you understand that, you cannot manage that. All you can do is position yourself to capitalize on that opportunity. How do you do that? Well, I can only share my experiences. What we tried to do in the last business, one of the other two businesses, as well as the one that I'm doing with the bank, is appoint, we're not calling them change managers or champions, but we're calling them facilitators. So we remove the word change from the organization, because the moment we found that change was associated with HR, and executives were saying, go to HR, it's not my job. So we called it facilitate, and we started to refer to the leaders as facilitators. Lead facilitator becomes a CEO. Lead manager becomes a departmental head. So you can use language that works for you, because language is very important. Grammar is absolutely critical in strategy. And we then created separate teams. In fact, we're working with Sean on one of those projects, whereby you then have an individual embedded in every team. But that individual is part of the strategic team. So the executives sitting at executive level become sponsors of particular projects that is driving change in the organization, and they sit in those meetings. They do not delegate. So in other words, change cannot be delegated to the second tier. You have to make so the finance director will have a project. It doesn't have to be in finance, it can be in marketing, but he or she is a sponsor and is responsible for making that transition, signing off things, but obviously supported by a facilitator who's technically adaptable to change. Because change is about very simple things, behaviors. I used to behave like this, from, to, where do I move to? So very important. Now I know it doesn't give you all the answers, but I think you have to try and experiment. But the key thing is, let it be led by the executives. They have to have the time. If they don't have the time, it means they are wasting time doing operations.
Thank you.
And then I always say to people, always consider, and it has been said before, that the opportunity of a lifetime must be seized in the lifetime of the opportunity. The opportunity of a lifetime must be seized in the lifetime of the opportunity. And that's what change is about. If you don't seize that opportunity in the window that it's alive, there's not going to be change. It's going to freeze. I hope that helps you. But I don't have all the answers. I've made spectacular mistakes. It's a question of learning from those. And as we end, I'll just share one mistake very quickly. We bought a business in Nigeria. We lost $165 million, 165. And why did we lose that? Because we hired South Africans to go and run that business. And when they arrived there, they would switch off, because in South Africa, I live in Johannesburg. In South Africa, we switch off at 3 p.m. on a Friday and return on Monday. But Nigeria doesn't shut. It's a 24-hour economy. So the CEO wants a conversation at the Yacht Club on Saturday. You're not available. There's a pub where they're having a drinks. You're not available. So you do not become part of the culture. You don't get the nuances. And therefore, we will go to a board meeting, and I was in one of those meetings. We're in the board meeting, but everything has been discussed in the pubs. But we come to the board meeting expecting a discussion. The decision is made, but you don't know that decision. And you don't know, so we had bought a business, we were not able to change it. And the way that it hit me is, actually we were sitting in a board, in the board meeting with Dagotti, who was one of the shareholders. Is we walked in, there's a presentation from our South Africa manager. The guys from Nigeria left for tea. They never came back. And then I was asking why they come, and they said, you can't come from South Africa and tell me what to do. So we were not engaged. So this change is about understanding these nuances. You have to be immersed. You don't have to agree with everything, but understand it and use it. You can only change something if you understand it. Thank you so much.